Hi guys. So I'm your host Charlene and welcome to today's episode of Inherently. We're going to be talking about empathy development within adolescence. I know that when you're a teenager, you may or may not be thinking of other people a lot because there is honestly so much going on during that time. And I think that honestly, as I've grown up and I've looked at other teenagers, I have a nephew who's actually 14. Fun fact. But I feel like they do have concern for other people, but they're definitely their primary concern is definitely themselves. So it's really interesting to see how that sort of switches, um, or may not switch, but it depends on the person, but sort of changes as they grow up and then you become an adult. And I feel like you become more aware of other people and, more aware of how your actions impact other people. I think of me specifically when I was a teenager, I guess, yeah. I would like to think that I've always been empathetic towards other people, but with my parents, I've kind of always been very not always, but as a teen, I was kind of very one-track minded. They don't know what it's like to be me at this age and this generation. But listen to your parents. That's all I can say. They really do know. They really do know. They really do know. But yeah, I think now that I am a 22-year-old adult, teenagers kind of are intimidating. I saw this TikTok the other day about teenagers, there were teenagers rating whether or not adults were cool or not. And I was like, would they think that I'm cool? Because they were being ruthless. Anyway, this intro is completely unrelated. I do think teens have empathy. However, their development is pretty similar to older children in that it's very affected by increased socialization and, again, need for helping others. So, teenage empathy is markedly different from adult empathy, and this is largely due to the bulk of changes occurring during this period. These changes coincide with increasingly complex social relationships and contexts. I don't know if you've ever seen those teenagers, or if you were in a teenager, high school relationship and you were like, oh, this is the end. This is, if we, when they just take those relationships so seriously. So anyway, increasingly complex social relationships and contexts, they'll find their best friend and that's their best friend for life. They'll ride or die about their friends and their relationships at that time. Anyway, teens with healthy levels of empathy display fewer mental health symptoms, and those without typically display the onset of major mental disorders, such as depression, anxiety, and, psychopathies, schizophrenia, etc. Early symptoms of psychopathy is initially found in early childhood, but become more profound in adolescence. Traits such as insensitivity, superficial emotion, lack of remorse, and persistent violation of social norms correlate with neurocognitive deficits in the anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, and the amygdala, which can be predictive of antisocial behavior in adolescence. Additionally, attachment theory plays a role here as well, as it can be predictive of empathy within adolescence, with adolescents ages 14 to 19 years old in a self-study report reporting secure attachment to parents, correlating with greater self-reported empathic scores and perspective taking on the IRI. In a study conducted on 13 to 17-year-olds, it was discovered that adolescents who reported having higher cognitive empathy had higher functioning connectivity within the DMN. The DMN is involved in processes beyond empathy, but in this study, it suggests that in adolescence, it specifically underscores internally focused cognitive empathy development. In a study conducted on a sample of participants between the ages of 14 and 18 years old, subjects were separated into 4 groups: adolescents, young adults, and 2 older groups, and it was found that the 2 younger groups, adolescents and young adults, displayed higher cognitive empathy and had higher social functioning than the 2 older groups. Now, that was a very, very brief overview of teenage empathy from the research that I conducted with my literature review. However, it's very complex, and I feel like the best way to exemplify that is through our guest. Okay, what does empathy mean to you?
I think empathy means to see things from different point of views.
And like, can you give an example of how you've used empathy in your like day-to-day life or recently or just in general?
I haven't even seen empathy. I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you. What does empathy mean to you?
I would say empathy means like when like so you see somebody being emotional and then you're like, oh, comforting or whatever, like just being there for them instead of like being goofy.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And can you think of any times recently that you like used empathy to help a friend or somebody that you've seen in pain or anything like that?
No.
Okay.
Well, like close friends, yeah, but like if like we're not that close and like you're crying or whatever, I'll just distance myself because I'm not a very serious person.
Okay. I get it. So you think empathy like requires you to be serious for sure, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Know how to read room, just like
Yeah. Okay, thank you. What does empathy mean to you?
Empathy is when someone else is feeling some type of way and it has an impact on you or someone else. If you're feeling the type of way, it has an impact on them. They feel your empathy.
And in comparison between the boys and the girls at your school, do you think the boys show more empathy or the girls show more empathy, or do you think it's about even?
I think the girls definitely show more empathy towards one another, but it also depends on the scenario. If it's a girl to a boy, the boy will show empathy for the girl. But if it's a boy to a girl, I don't think the girl will show empathy. I think she'll like treat him as like get over it. Like there's other girls or whatever the case may be.
Can you elaborate on why you might think that is a little bit?
I think it's partly because most boys are raised to be men don't cry. So I think it's like, honestly, I feel like guys don't really talk about their feelings. And when they get that comfortable with you, a girl shouldn't treat it as like a brush over. And it should be treated as like, these are my feelings and I'm comfortable with you. And so I think like when a guy feels some type of way about something, we should acknowledge that and not brush it over.
What does empathy mean to you guys?
empathy means to me is like the ability to understand someone without no judgment. It could be like an emotional connection with them and just understanding their problems, issues, and just not saying like negative things to them or just avoiding them. I also agree. It's like an emotional connection, and it's like putting your like understanding them emotionally, not just physically, and then putting yourself in their shoes. You know what I'm saying? Like, of course, you could like not judge them because of what they're going through, because you understand what they're going through. And I think that's what empathy means.
And between between the boys and the girls at your school, who do you think displays more empathy, like in terms of just general situations, or like if you're going through something, or is it about like even between the two?
I feel like it depends on certain people. Cause like some people that I know, they do show a little bit more empathy. Like boys that I know do show a little bit more empathy, but there's some that like, just like the crowd they hang out with, they like act a certain type of way and stuff like that. So I feel like it depends on like a person. Like if you're cool with that person, I feel like they'll show more empathy. But if like they're just like the random person, then they'll probably be the same. Like in general, since I'm a girl, I think girls show more empathy because we understand each other's situation. And like there's things that we have that boys don't have, they don't have to deal with. And like I was raised like in like a girl home too, so that's one of the things. But most of my family is like boys, so I do understand, especially since I have a brother. I wouldn't say he's like emotional, but like when we're at home, like he understands me. But at school is like a whole different thing. Yeah. He's graduating though.
So what does empathy mean to you?
Empathy means to me like making like sure others feel like making sure they feel like not secure but secured in a way of like when it comes down to having somebody else, like I like to show empathy to others, like I would want it to be shown to me, so I'm gonna do the same for others. I'll make sure everyone's like feels heard, feels understood, loved, stuff like that.
And can you think of any recent like times where you had to show empathy to like a friend or a stranger, or like just a general example?
I can. It was like 2 weeks ago. My friend was having like a breakdown because she was just upset, and I just wanted her to feel like, she was understood. Like I was there for her. I even missed class to be with her. I didn't want her to be by herself. So it's just like, no, I would want somebody to do that for me. I'm gonna do it for her.
Okay, thank you so much.
Let's meet our next guest, Dr. Stern.
So I'm Dr. Jessie Stern. I'm a research scientist at University of Virginia. I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm really interested in how teens and also younger kids develop in their social skills and emotions over time. Right now, I'm working in an adolescent research lab that looks at things like peer relationships and empathy from about age 13 all the way into middle adulthood. And I'm going to be starting as an assistant professor at Pomona College in fall of 2024. So really excited about that. And looking forward to starting a lab focused on young children's social emotional development in the context of family.
Amazing. Okay, so I'm going to get straight into the questions. I recently talked to some teenagers at the high school, like the children as well. And I found that the children didn't really know what empathy was, which I wasn't too surprised about. However, I was a little bit more surprised when the teenagers also didn't really know too much about empathy when I asked them. So I was just wondering, some of their responses were a little bit less, I don't know, I guess in depth than I wanted them to be, but it was a very casual sort of situation. And there's also just the pressure of me asking them these questions very randomly on a Friday afternoon. So I was just wondering if you had any comments on why maybe you feel they might have those responses, or what you think the trajectory is in terms of adolescent development of empathy.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we can separate two things, one of which is adolescents' ability to actually empathize with other people. And that is maybe a little bit distinct from being able to say what empathy is and to articulate it in a way that's coherent and has that metacognitive awareness. So to that first part, we know that teens usually exhibit pretty stable empathy across adolescence, or even sometimes increasing rates of empathy toward peers. So especially things like the ability to take others' perspectives and the ability to take context into account. So I think this person was feeling this way because this was everything that led up to that experience. And one of the things that we see in our research when we put teens and their closest friend into a room and just ask them to talk about a problem that one of them is having is that teens are actually pretty skilled at providing the kind of emotional support and instrumental support to that friend. So they're able to do these things. And I think that ability gets better over time. So that's kind of a neat finding, because the stereotype is that adolescents actually have that some sort of dip in their empathic ability, but the data show that's actually not true. In particular, close friendships seem to be some kind of training ground for adolescents to build those types of skills. If my close friend has an issue, they're leaning on me for support, and I get practice giving them the kind of empathy and understanding that they need and that grows the friendship. Maybe one of the reasons that it's difficult for them to articulate what empathy is that they haven't been asked. They think unless you have some kind of social and emotional learning program that talks about these things in a really explicit way, it wouldn't be until a teenager maybe gets to a college psychology class that they would be thinking in those ways. So I think the ability might be there, even if their capacity to describe what empathy is not quite there.
I'm going to ask a question about something that you said. You talked specifically about the ability for adolescents to develop close friendships, heavily correlating with how well they're able to empathize with others. Do you think that without those close friendships, they're unable to develop that same level of empathy, or are there other ways that they're able to do it through things like family members, or I don't know, other situations that aren't necessarily then requiring close friendships?
Yeah, that's such an important question. We'll start really broadly by just saying that developing close friendships is considered a central task of adolescence. So not just for things like empathy, but for other types of social skills, like being able to give and receive support, which we know is important later on for things like romantic relationships and parenting, but also just for cultivating a sense of belonging in your peer group and having someone who can provide support in a school context, for example. Typically, teens start to spend less time with their family of origin and more time with peers around age 14 to 16. That's a normative shift, and it's usually a pretty positive one. The tricky part is it really depends on what types of peers you're hanging with in terms of empathy development. If you're hanging out with really antisocial peers, you are more likely to show antisocial traits yourselves. But if you select into or if you choose friends who are really empathic, one, that's correlated with your empathy ability at the start, but also if you have highly empathic friends, it's associated with more growth in your empathy skills over time. So it's not just the fact of having friends, but it's what type. I think one of the cool things is if you don't have much empathy in your family of origin, so if you don't have really positive relationships with your parents, let's say, you can choose peers who do have those traits and can model the social skills that you want to cultivate. But conversely, let's say you don't have a great group of friends and maybe you don't have a great sense of social belonging in your school for any set of reasons. I think that you can get a certain amount of developmental support through your family. So we know that things like secure attachment to your parents is associated with the development of empathy, and parents modeling empathy both toward you, so your firsthand experience of receiving it, but also toward other people, especially if your parents are empathetic toward outgroup members, for example. That can be really powerful because teens are picking up on, okay, what groups, what targets should I extend myself toward? All that is to say, there are so many different socialization influences on a teen, including social media, which I think you mentioned is in your thesis, and teachers as well. So sometimes there are classroom-based empathy programs or social emotional learning programs. A lot of those are mindfulness-based programs, but they can also be other things as well. Bottom line, friendships are really, really important, especially during the teenage years, but there are other ways that teens can learn empathy for sure.
So in the literature, they talk a lot about how adolescence is sort of like I don't want to say, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this, but it's sort of like the point in which a lot of symptoms for mental health issues appear or become more prominent, or on the flip side, like they can be altered in like an opposite direction and become, less prominent over time. With empathy specifically, which is just like a general pro-social behavior, do you think that adolescence is the turning point for whether or not a person is able to like develop empathy in a, I guess, increasing way over time? Or just generally like at all within their life? Or do you think that there's like a later point in time in which like empathy can be modulated?
A nice question. So to start, we see evidence of empathy as early as the toddler years. So as soon as kids are able to sort of understand what another person is feeling, even at a rudimentary level, toddlers and preschoolers will try to offer comfort, let's say, when someone is hurt or upset. So some of the research that I've done that's actually really fun is to, interact with a 3 to 4 year old and pretend that I've hit my finger and in a lot of pain. And oftentimes this 3 or 4 year old will come over, say, hey, what's wrong? Try to rub my finger or do something that offers some physical comfort. So those behaviors are there pretty early and they continue to develop throughout the childhood years. But the cool thing about adolescence is it's considered a sensitive period for the development of the social brain. So researchers like Blakemore and Knowles have looked at how adolescents' brains are especially plastic and really sensitive to the presence of peers, to inputs from other social figures. So they seem to be especially attuned to what's socially normative in their group and kind of on the lookout for things that are tipping them off, like, who am I supposed to be kind to? Is kindness and empathy, is that a social norm? is it valued within my peer group, or is it something that I would be made fun of if I, put myself out there and was kind to this person? So they're really highly attuned to what's going on in their immediate environment. You mentioned also that adolescence is often a period of onset for a lot of psychopathology. And one of the interesting things about empathy is it's sometimes considered a risky strength. So if I'm a really empathetic person, I tend to resonate with other people's emotions. You add that trait to a really negative experience, like maybe my parent is depressed, or I've experienced maltreatment or trauma, or I've got a friend who's really depressed and I'm providing a lot of empathic support for them. Maybe there's some co-rumination, like we just talk a lot about how bad we feel. That can lead to some negative outcomes, including increased risk for depression. But on the other hand, if I'm a really empathic teen and I don't have those other risk factors, sometimes I'm able to thrive over and above my peers because empathy can be a real strength in other social situations. It can be valued by teachers and other adults. So I think it's interesting that, especially during the teenage years, it can be a strength, but it can also be a risk factor for some of those things you mentioned, especially internalizing symptoms like anxiety and depression.
And then you mentioned a lot of different things that are factors that can influence like how empathy is developed. You talked about like teachers and then friend groups and social media, lots of different things. So that's lots of different elements. But do you think that there's like one particular element that's more heavily impacts like the adolescent's ability to develop empathy? And then are there other elements that you didn't mention that like you would like to include?
Yeah, I will say that in psychology research generally, which you probably know, a lot of our effect diagnoses are kind of small. So there are so many elements that might influence a team of empathy, including genetics and temperamental traits. So how sensitive you are to your environment, for example. If you've got a really highly sensitive temperament in combination with a very nurturing upbringing, secure attachment to your parents, and great relationships with empathic peers, that sounds like a recipe for a pretty highly empathic teen. But, there's so many factors that can be at play. So I'm a little hesitant to say this one is the biggest influence. But I certainly think that for teens, because they're so attuned to their social world and they're paying attention to what is accepted and what is not, that your immediate microcosm, like your friends, your family members, and your school or your classroom, those things where you've got daily interactions with your core circle of people are probably going to matter most during that period of time. So because I'm a teenager and I'm really highly attuned to what my social world is doing, probably whoever I'm having the most interactions with on a daily basis will be really influential. One thing we didn't talk about, but that's been important in the research is gender. So of course, at least in the United States and in Western culture, there are these gender stereotypes and gender norms that really value things like empathy, girls specifically. So especially if you just ask people to self-report empathy, girls tend to self-report more than boys. But if you actually observe behavior, a lot of those differences go away. So interestingly, boys are a little bit more likely to engage in prosocial behavior, especially public prosocial behavior. So other people are sort of watching and are going to see that I am or am not being kind to another person. Boys can really step up and show these forms of comforting, caring, being kind to another person. So some of it is just about what is valued for a particular gender identity. And some of it is also what you elicit from your social environment. So as a boy, if I've got parents who maybe buy into the traditional gender norms for masculinity in my culture, then if I show emotion like sympathy, or if I'm crying because I'm seeing suffering in the world that I think is not just, a parent's reaction could be tone that down or no. Whereas I think boys are equally capable of experiencing empathy and showing it if it's nurtured by their social group. So if instead the parent were to say, yeah, this is a really sad situation, it's totally okay to cry, I also feel really sad when I see this kind of injustice being done, then, boys can certainly flourish in that set of skills. So gender is an interesting one because it's so contextual, and so based on what we value in our culture.
So just going off of the gender question, I did talk to the teenagers about like whether they thought, boys or girls showed more empathy towards them, and it was sort of mixed answers. So, I mean, that correlates to what you said, essentially, like, it could be either gender. However, I recently did record the episode on empathy and gender with some of my peers, and the general consensus was that essentially males show less empathy. Do you think that during adolescence is sort of that turning point of whether or not a man or a woman shows more empathy, or is it just a continuous sort of developmental thing, and there's many different factors that influence the ability of that person specifically, or is it more so a gendered thing?
That's a really interesting question. What I can tell you is when we look at preschool kids, the rewinding a little bit many years before becoming a teenager, when we look at preschool kids, their parents are reporting that girls show more empathy and prosocial behavior. But in the lab, when we ask them to respond to, for example, that example I gave you earlier of banging my finger on the table or dropping something and seeing if they'll pick it up, or just looking at their facial expression in response to an emotion that the experimenter has, there are no gender differences. So what's interesting about that is parents' perceptions, their reports of what's going on, align exactly with what your peers are saying. But just what we hope is objective observation doesn't really show very many differences at that age. Maybe by the time you get into high school, there are more differences that could just be readily observed. But it also kind of depends on how you're thinking about empathy. If you're thinking about empathy as mostly an emotional response of I look really concerned and I'm nodding with what you're saying, and I'm reflecting back, oh, that must have been so sad or so scary. I think girls, because a lot of their friendships during adolescence are based on that kind of emotional exchange, yeah, they might have more practice doing that kind of stuff. But for boys, it could very well be that empathy is being expressed differently in adolescence, and maybe more in the form of instrumental support. So I know my friend had a really hard day yesterday. I'm probably not going to ask him how he feels. And maybe I'm going to show up and say, hey, do you want to hang out? Or just be present with him. So it could just manifest in a different type of behavior that's not as recognized. Or there could be true meaningful differences between boys and girls. In the self-reports, so when boys and girls are kind of self-reporting on their empathy in different situations, girls tend to report more empathic concern. So that's I really care about other people's emotions. If someone's suffering, I feel something about that. Boys tend to report equal levels of perspective taking, so I can put myself in somebody else's shoes. So that's another interesting part of this, is that boys and girls seem to be pretty equal when it comes to that cognitive part, putting myself in someone's shoes or taking their perspective. But girls maybe are a little bit freer to talk about the emotional part, like the concern for others' welfare.
And then it just sounds like a final wrap-up question, is there anything that you would like to add, or just any other final comments that you have?
Yeah, I think you mentioned this earlier in what you've already been looking at, which is great, but the dimension of race and group membership is really important when we think about what the boundaries of our moral circle are, and teenagers are especially sensitive to that. So if in my immediate friend group, there's a lot of diversity, it is really, really important for teens to be able to empathize with people who have experiences that are different from theirs. But if within my peer group, there's a lot of racism, or there's a lot of homophobia, or there are ways in which my parents maybe socialize me to not care about certain types of people, that could actually be a political outgroup or a religious outgroup, but that really matters during adolescence. I think there are ways in which social media can make those group differences more intense, stronger, but there are also ways that, depending on what you're exposed to, social media can break down those barriers. So if you are a kid living in a really homogenous kind of school district, like you don't tend to meet very many LGBTQ kids, for example, but on social media, you're seeing the lived experience of LGBTQ kids represented there, then maybe that helps you empathize with those kids that you wouldn't necessarily have had experiences with in your hometown. So I feel like social media can be used as a tool for better and for worse when it comes to these group differences. But what we do know for sure is that just exposure to diversity tends to be really, really good for kids' empathy across age groups, probably especially in adolescence.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stern. I really appreciate you taking the time out to answer these questions. And do you have any questions for me before we wrap everything up?
I don't think so. Thank you, Charlene. You asked such great questions, and I really appreciate you doing this work on this topic. It's really interesting.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Stern, and thank you so much to the teenagers that I interviewed. I want to emphasize that I do not think that they don't have empathy. I know that it somewhat comes across like that throughout the episode. However, I just think that, like Dr. Stern is saying, they don't have the vocabulary to really talk about empathy, and they've never really been asked about empathy. And again, it was on like a random Friday afternoon I was asking them these questions. Yeah, I think that they definitely have the capacity, but like that it's a growing capacity that they learn more and more about with each interaction, with growing closer relationships, with having their first romantic relationships, with their parental examples and things like that. I found it surprising, however, that they didn't really see any difference amongst the two genders as much. This somewhat aligns with the literature, but also not really, which we'll find out in the gender episode. Yeah, but on top of that, on the flip side, I also feel like teenagers as a whole, like as a group, maybe I don't interact with them enough, but they don't really have as much concern about what's going on in the world as I did when I was a teenager. But I think that didn't really develop until I was in like my junior, senior year of high school. But I think maybe that just comes with different environments and different intersectional struggles that the teenagers are facing at that time. Empathy is not only a important skill, but like she said, it is a costly skill, and it is not something that is an emotion without like depth to it and weight to it. So I can completely understand them not having as much commentary on it. But thank you so much for watching today's episode, and I hope you tune in to the next episode. Sorry, listening to today's episode.